So what we're looking at here isn't just a simple political squabble or some protest that happened at a restaurant. No. This is about what happens when power feels like it's being exposed. Because when a leader who thrives on an image of dominance suddenly feels watched or questioned, well, the response is never calm, and it reveals absolutely everything.
Okay, let's just sit with that quote for a second. Something turned. That phrase tells you so much. It suggests that behind closed doors, something fundamental shifted in a way that just can't be put back together. This wasn't a simple disagreement between two political allies. It was a deep psychological break. So the real question isn't just what happened, but why it happened like this, so suddenly, so publicly, and so full of accusation.
I mean, for years, this was a pretty simple story, right? Marjorie Taylor Green literally built her political identity on being close to Donald Trump's power. She was his most aggressive defender, his loudest ally. And he, in turn, seemed to reward that kind of loyalty. But then, boom, the relationship didn't just cool off, it completely shattered. She went from being the ultimate ally to being framed as a problem, a traitor, and a serious risk.
So what was the actual trigger? Well, on the surface, it's a pretty straightforward chain of events. You start with that really close alignment we just talked about. Then you get this moment of public vulnerability, protesters confronting Donald Trump at a restaurant, and finally the accusation. A story gets leaked to the press that Trump suspected Green of tipping off the protesters. He even supposedly contacted the Secret Service about her.
And that right there is the key, isn't it? You have to ask yourself, if the worry was really about security, this would have all stayed quiet, behind the scenes. The fact that this accusation was leaked to the media tells you it was never just about finding out what happened. It was about showing something. It was a performance, a warning shot, designed to isolate someone publicly.
Okay, so let's peel back the layers and get to the real heart of this, the psychology of power. This is where we go way beyond the headlines. Because when a leader's image of total control is threatened, their first instinct isn't to find the truth, it's to protect their story, their narrative, at any and all costs.
So let's talk about this idea of dominance theater. Think about it. Donald Trump's power has always relied on him being the center of emotional gravity, the one who commands all the attention, all the loyalty, and all the fear. When that gravity feels like it's weakening, like it did with that protest, the response isn't to talk it out. It's a public show of force, like leaking a formal investigation to pull everyone back into orbit and reassert control.
And that, of course, brings us to the scapegoat. The accusation against Marjorie Taylor Green wasn't really about finding proof. It was about finding a person, a vessel, to pour all that anxiety and fear of uncertainty into. It's a neat trick, really. It transforms that uncomfortable feeling of being vulnerable into a much more simple, much more manageable story of betrayal.
So how does the brain actually do that? Well, there's a psychological mechanism for it called hostile interpretation bias. Basically, once an internal switch flips and a former ally is suddenly relabeled as dangerous, everything they've ever done is seen through this new suspicious filter. All of these neutral little dots, a phone call here, a restaurant suggestion there, are suddenly connected to form a hostile shape, a whole conspiracy. You don't need evidence because the narrative itself creates all the logic you need.
Right. So this is where things really start to ramp up, because the conflict has escalated way beyond a simple disagreement. It has become a full-blown war over what these events actually mean. It's a battle between two completely different stories.
And this chart, wow, it just lays out the two sides of that narrative war perfectly. On one side, you have Donald Trump's story. It's all about betrayal from an insider, focused entirely on Marjorie Taylor Greene's supposed disloyalty. But on the other side, you've got her counter-narrative. This is retaliation for her speaking the truth, and it's focused on his team's incompetence and their efforts to suppress her.
But here's the thing. Here's the most dangerous part of Marjorie Taylor Greene's response. She completely reframed the story. By asking, hey, why wasn't the restaurant secure in the first place? She shifts the entire spotlight away from her loyalty and shines it directly on his team's competence. And for a leader whose entire brand is built on strength and control, the suggestion of failure or weakness, that is way more threatening than any protest.
You know, there's this idea that power isn't really afraid of its enemies. What it's truly terrified of are mirrors. Mirrors that reflect uncomfortable truths. And by talking about things like the Epstein files and aligning with survivors, Marjorie Taylor Greene became a kind of symbolic mirror, suggesting that Donald Trump's public image isn't the whole story. And in that kind of dynamic, attacking the person holding the mirror becomes a desperate way to try and shatter that reflection.
Okay, so let's just pull back for a second and look at the big picture here. What does this whole episode really reveal? This isn't just about the psychology of one person. It's about a process.
It's about that moment when a leader's personal paranoia stops being just a feeling and starts to become an organized operational system. And this is how it happens. It's a three-step process, really. It starts with a leader's private anxiety, a personal fear of being exposed or humiliated. Then, that fear gets dressed up in an institutional costume, using the official language of national security. As the analysis here says, my fear becomes our threat. And finally, actual institutions like the Secret Service are used not to find truth, but to enforce the leader's narrative and signal danger to everyone else.
So what you get is this escalation loop. At this point, any kind of reconciliation is basically impossible. Both Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Green are now trapped by the stories they've created. They are servants of their own narratives. To back down now would be to admit their story was wrong. And that just forces their behavior to become more rigid, more defensive, and more extreme. And so all of this, it leaves us with one pretty unsettling final question. The entire psychological machine we've just unpacked, the dominance theater, the scapegoating, the paranoia becoming a system, all of it was triggered by a pretty minor public protest. So if this is how this kind of power behaves over a few chants in a restaurant, what will it do when the subject isn't chants, but names?